Picture the scene. It's 1880, and you're in a damp, poorly ventilated laboratory, right in the heart of Paris. You have to imagine the smell. The air is thick with the sharp, metallic stench of carbolic acid, heavily mixed with the terrified scent of animals. Right in the center of the room, standing around a heavy wooden table, two laboratory assistants are engaged in a brutal, desperate wrestling match with a massive, completely wild bulldog. The dog is totally rigid. Its muscles are locked, and its eyes are dilated into sheer terror and aggression because it is in the advanced, furious stages of rabies. Thick, ropey saliva is actively foaming and dripping from its jaws, laced with literally one of the most lethal biological agents on the planet. The assistants are wearing thick leather gloves, but the visible strain is immense. Sweat is pouring down their faces as they fight to pin this convulsing animal to the wood. We must position ourselves firmly in the medical reality of that era. There are no safe, reliable anesthetics to sedate this animal, no tranquilizer darts, and no paralytic drugs. If that dog breaks loose, it will attack. And an attack means a transmission of the virus. An infection from a rabid animal is not just a medical emergency. It is an absolute, non-negotiable death sentence with a 100% fatality rate. The incubation period is a torturous psychological waiting game where you are just waiting for a neurological descent into spasms, hallucinations, and a terrifying inability to swallow water known as hydrophobia, culminating eventually in a suffocating death for which there is absolutely no cure. Those are the absolute fatal stakes in that room. Then, a man steps forward from the shadows of the lab. He doesn't do what you'd expect. He voluntarily leans over this thrashing, deadly animal. He doesn't reach for a crude syringe, which were notoriously unreliable back then anyway, and basically useless for this. He doesn't put on an iron mask or any heavy protective gear. Instead, he takes a fragile, incredibly thin glass tube and places it directly between his own lips, lowering his face mere inches from the dog's snapping, foam-covered teeth. He waits for a split second of relative calm, inserts the other end of that fragile glass tube directly into the bulldog's mouth, and begins to suck up a few drops of the deadly saliva to use for his microbial cultures. It is an image that entirely defies modern laboratory protocols in every conceivable way. One sudden jerk of the dog's head, one accidental crunch of those powerful jaws on the glass tube, or even just a microscopic scratch on the man's lip or a tiny open sore inside his mouth, and the virus is in his bloodstream. It's a guaranteed, agonizing death. It requires a level of physical courage, or maybe just sheer terrifying hubris that is almost impossible to comprehend today. It is the ultimate gamble. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you were captivated by the hidden truths of history's most towering figures, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video with fellow history seekers as we step further into the shadows. The man with the glass tube between his lips, risking everything for a few drops of lethal saliva, is Louis Pasteur. He is the name on literally every milk carton in your local grocery store, the undisputed patron saint of modern medicine. This is the man who fundamentally proved the germ theory of disease, dragged humanity out of the dark ages of miasma theory, and gave us the foundational principles of microbiology and immunology. The name Pasteur is, in the global consciousness, entirely synonymous with scientific purity, tireless dedication, and the salvation of mankind. He was canonized almost at the level of a secular deity. But our mission today is to take you behind that heavy velvet curtain of historical canonization. By rigorously exploring the historical archives, his incredibly public, theatrical scientific triumphs, and, most critically, his recently opened, highly secretive, private laboratory notebooks, the story completely flips. When you stack the carefully curated public myth against the raw, unfiltered data in his private journals, you uncover a massive, tangled web of contradictions. For nearly a century, those laboratory notebooks were held by his family, completely sealed off from any independent historical scrutiny. When independent scholars finally gained access, a very different portrait emerged. The private records reveal a man who was intensely competitive, relentlessly authoritarian, deeply flawed, and more than willing to bend the truth, appropriate the work of his rivals, and push ethical boundaries to points that would absolutely horrify a modern medical review board. Every time you drink a glass of milk without fear of listeria, enjoy cold beer that hasn't spoiled, or receive a life-saving vaccine, you owe a massive, undeniable debt of safety to this man's vision. But today, we are going to ask you to sit with a truly uncomfortable, multidimensional question. What if the father of microbiology was also a master of deception? What if the man who literally saved millions of lives built his empire by stealing core concepts from his scientific rivals and gambled recklessly with human lives to secure his own legacy? Let us trace this entire journey, starting from a place you would probably never expect. Because Louis Pasteur was not born a scientific prodigy. If you met him as a teenager, you wouldn't see the future savior of humanity in the slightest. Born in 1822 in Dole, a small, working-class town in the Jura region of eastern France, he came from very humble beginnings, with the family living in near poverty. His father was a tanner, a notoriously harsh and incredibly foul-smelling profession, involving the chemical treatment of animal hides. Having been a fiercely patriotic sergeant major in Napoleon's army, his father instilled a really rigid sense of nationalistic duty in young Louis. Academically, however, Louis was thoroughly average. Historical accounts heavily suggest he struggled with what we would now recognize as dyslexia and dysgraphia, having immense difficulty with basic reading and writing mechanics. His only undeniable talent was artistic. The young Louis Pasteur was an incredibly gifted artist, specifically working with oil pastels, spending hours sketching meticulously detailed portraits of his family and the local townspeople. He was obsessed with capturing the exact geometry of a face, the precise shading of an eye, and the symmetry of human features. He showed absolutely zero early signs of scientific genius. No blowing things up in the basement, no dissecting frogs. He was just a quiet teenager with a sketch pad and a fishing rod. The pastel portraits that survive today are remarkable. They show a highly developed, almost obsessive eye for minute visual detail and a profound ability to observe and replicate physical reality. But at the age of 19, recognizing the harsh economic realities of 19th century rural France, he made a calculated, difficult pivot. Realizing art was unlikely to support him or elevate his social standing, he essentially abandoned the canvas. He turned his intense, singular focus toward chemistry and physics, eventually grinding his way through sheer, stubborn persistence into the prestigious École Normale Supérieure in Paris. The crucial realization here is that he didn't actually abandon his artist's eye. He just changed his canvas, trading the sketch pad for the microscope. That specific, visually trained artistic background is exactly what allowed him, at the young age of 26, to solve a massive, confounding mystery in the world of chemistry: the enigma of tartrate crystals, which are chemical compounds found in the dregs of wine vats. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, we have to look at the scientific landscape of the 1840s. The greatest chemical minds of Europe were entirely baffled by a phenomenon involving polarized light, essentially how light bends. They had two chemical substances derived from wine: sodium ammonium tartrate and paratartrate, also known as racemic acid. Through all the chemical analysis available at the time, these two substances appeared to have the exact same chemical composition, the exact same number of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. But they behaved completely differently when polarized light was shone through them. One substance would bend or rotate the plane of the light to the right, and the other substance, despite having the exact same chemical makeup on paper, didn't bend the light at all. It was a total chemical paradox that defied the fundamental laws of chemistry as they understood them. If two things are made of the exact same parts, they should behave the exact same way, so the prevailing belief was that the internal arrangement of the atoms must just be identical. Pasteur, armed with that teenage portrait artist's obsession with symmetry and visual detail, decided to look closer. He grew large crystals of these salts and put them right under his microscope. What he saw was something every other eminent chemist had completely missed: tiny asymmetrical facets on the edges of the crystals. They weren't perfectly symmetrical cubes or prisms. They had a handedness. We can visualize this perfectly with your own two hands. They are made of the exact same materials: 4 fingers, 1 thumb, palm, skin, bone, and have the exact same structural formula. But you cannot superimpose your left hand perfectly over your right hand if they're facing the same way. They are mirror images of each other, just as you cannot put a left-handed glove on a right hand. Pasteur realized that the mysteriously inactive paratartrate was actually a mixture of 2 different types of crystals: left-handed ones and right-handed ones. The reason the mixture didn't bend the light was that the left-handed crystals were bending the light to the left, and the right-handed crystals were bending it an equal amount to the right, perfectly canceling each other out. So, what did he do? He literally took a pair of fine tweezers, sat at his microscope, and painstakingly, crystal by microscopic crystal, manually sorted the left-handed shapes into one pile and the right-handed shapes into another pile. He physically separated them based entirely on their visual geometry. Then he dissolved each pile in water and shone the light through them again. The right-handed pile bent the light to the right, and the left-handed pile bent the light to the left. At 26 years old, the former portrait artist discovered molecular chirality, proving that molecules have a 3-dimensional shape and handedness, basically single-handedly launching the entire field of stereochemistry. It was a stunning achievement of visual observation over abstract theory, proving that the geometric shape of a molecule is just as important as its chemical formula. This discovery has profound implications for biology, as almost all biological molecules, the literal building blocks of life itself, like the proteins in our bodies and the DNA in our cells, are chiral and have a specific handedness. Pasteur was the very first human to peer into that geometric reality. However, it also highlights a personality trait that would come to define his entire life: an absolutely terrifying level of obsession. The man sat there with tweezers, sorting microscopic dust, and once he locked onto a problem, the rest of the universe basically ceased to exist. Nothing illustrates this tunnel vision better than the wild story of his wedding day in 1849. He was scheduled to marry Marie Laurent, the highly educated daughter of the university rector in Strasbourg, in what was a massive social event, literally the biggest day of his life. The guests were all gathered at the church in their finest mid-century attire. The priest was standing at the altar. The bride, Marie, was waiting, and the groom was nowhere to be found. In a panic, A messenger was dispatched across town to the university laboratory to track him down. They burst through the doors to find Pasteur standing at his lab bench, elbow deep in an experiment, staring through his microscope. He was so utterly consumed by the chemical reaction in front of him that he had entirely forgotten he was supposed to be getting married that afternoon. It perfectly encapsulates the psychological makeup of the man. To Marie-Laurent's immense credit, she did not walk away. She married him with a crystal-clear understanding of exactly who he was, knowing she was signing up to be second to his science. Over the decades, she became his absolutely indispensable, though entirely uncredited co-pilot. She managed his massive correspondence, acted as his intellectual sounding board, and meticulously recorded his thoughts. He was known to pace the room for hours, dictating complex scientific theories, while she would sit there and write them all down, organizing the absolute chaos of his mind. She was the organizational force behind his genius. But this intense academic obsession wasn't just driven by a pure, detached love of chemistry. There is a profound, heart-wrenching tragedy at the very core of Pasteur's life that acts as the real catalyst for everything that follows, forcing his pivot from sorting abstract, lifeless crystals into a desperate, lifelong war against living disease. The reality of the mid-19th century was harsh, particularly regarding childhood mortality, and the Pasteur family suffered unimaginable losses. Louis and Marie had 5 children together, but in a span of just a few years, they lost 3 of their daughters, Jeanne, Camille, and Cécile. They all died from typhoid fever, a brutal, highly infectious bacterial disease that ravages the intestinal tract. Sitting with the psychological weight of that is unfathomable. Losing one child is a grief most never recover from, but losing 3 to the exact same invisible killer is devastating. You can almost see the tectonic plates of his entire worldview shifting. Here is a man who believes he can understand the microscopic mechanics of the universe, who can sort invisible crystals. Yet he is utterly powerless to stop an invisible force from actively murdering his children in their beds. That trauma forged an absolute ironclad determination within him, eradicating his interest in pure abstract chemistry. He transitioned entirely into biology and pathology, essentially declaring an all-out personal war on the microscopic world. He was going to find out what the invisible mechanism of disease was, and he was going to destroy it. And this personal crusade leads directly into one of the most famous and heavily politicized scientific showdowns in history. This personal crusade against the microscopic world leads directly into one of the most famous and heavily politicized scientific showdowns in history, the War on Spontaneous Generation in the 1860s. The scientific debates of 19th century French academics were utterly ruthless. At the time, a highly respected and widely accepted biological theory was heterogenesis, or spontaneous generation. The general consensus was that simple life forms, like maggots, molds, and microscopic infusoria, just spontaneously popped into existence from dead or decaying organic matter. This wasn't a ridiculous idea based on magic. It was based on their daily observations. If you left a piece of raw meat out on a table, within days maggots appeared. If you left a vat of grain, mice seemed to generate from it, because they lacked the optical technology to see airborne microbes or microscopic eggs. It genuinely looked like a natural law of the universe, as if dead matter possessed some kind of vital force that could spontaneously organize itself into new, simple life. But Pasteur, armed with his early developing theories about germs and airborne microbes, argued that these microscopic entities were not generating from the meat. They were floating in the dust in the air. When that microscopic dust lands on your meat or your broth, the microbes consume the nutrients and multiply. Stepping into the ring to defend spontaneous generation was Félix Archimede Pouchet. History has often painted Pouchet as a stubborn, backwards fool clinging to medieval alchemy, but that is a gross misrepresentation. Pouchet was a highly respected naturalist, the director of the Museum of Natural History in Rouen, and a meticulous, serious empirical scientist. In 1859, he published a massive, highly detailed treatise arguing that under the right, strictly controlled conditions, new life definitively arises from the organic particles of dead generations. The debate became so intense that the French Academy of Sciences stepped in, turning it into a competition. They announced the Alhumbert Prize, complete with a substantial cash reward for whoever could settle the debate once and for all with rigorous, undeniable experiments. This is where Pasteur unveiled what is arguably his most brilliant piece of scientific theater, the Swan Neck Flask experiment, a masterclass in both mechanical design and public relations. The ingenuity lies in its elegant simplicity. Pasteur took standard glass flasks and filled them with a nutrient broth, essentially a clear yeast extract soup. Then he took a blowtorch, heated the glass neck of the flasks until they were pliable, and carefully bent them into an elongated downward then upward S shape, much like the graceful neck of a swan. He vigorously boiled the broth inside. The steam forced all the existing air and any living microbes out through the open neck, effectively sterilizing the interior. The absolute genius of the design is that the flask is completely open to the air at the very tip. Oxygen, which Pouchet and others argued was a necessary vital force for life, could flow freely back and forth into the flask. But any microscopic dust particles carrying germs that fell into the opening would get caught in the lower curve of that S shape by simple gravity. The dust couldn't travel upward, against gravity through the second curve to fall into the sterile broth. The results were visually stunning and seemingly irrefutable. The broth in the swan neck flasks remained perfectly clear and sterile. It remained pristine for days, months, and in some cases, years. But the very moment Pasteur physically snapped the glass neck off the flask, allowing the dust from the air to fall straight down into the broth, the liquid would turn cloudy and teem with microbial life within 24 hours. He literally took the show on the road, hiking up the Alps and scaling glaciers like the Mer de Glace just to snap the necks off flasks in the pristine, freezing mountain air. He proved that out of 20 flasks opened on a glacier, only 1 or 2 grew microbes, whereas all 20 opened on a dirty Parisian street corner grew microbes immediately. He demonstrated that the air merely acted as a vehicle for varying concentrations of invisible, germ-laden dust. He completely dismantled Pouchet in the public eye. Pouchet had designed a highly complex experiment using a trough of liquid mercury to seal out the ambient air while he introduced oxygen to his sterile hay broth. Pasteur publicly humiliated him by demonstrating that the dust settling on the surface of the heavy mercury in Pouchet's own laboratory was being dragged down into the broth when Pouchet inserted his instruments. He proved Pouchet was accidentally contaminating his own pristine samples. It was game, set, match for Pasteur. He claimed the prize, and spontaneous generation was relegated to the dustbin of history. But when we look at the historical reassessment, that triumphant narrative of pure objective science defeating backwards dogma completely falls apart. The modern analysis reveals that Pouchet was actually the more objective, fact-oriented scientist based on the evidence available, while Pasteur was deeply driven by political prejudice and mathematically saved by sheer, unadulterated luck. Let us look closely at the specific materials. Pasteur used broth made of yeast extract, but Pouchet used infusions made from boiled hay, which completely changes the game. Pouchet would boil his hay in water for an extended period, seal it perfectly using the methods of the day, and yet life still aggressively grew inside his flasks. Based on the biology of what he was working with, his conclusion was entirely logical. Unbeknownst to either man, hay is naturally laden with the spores of a specific bacterium called Bacillus subtilis. These bacterial endospores are a biological marvel. When facing extreme environmental stress, they form a tough, highly resilient inner core containing dipicolinic acid, which protects their DNA. These specific spores can easily survive being boiled in water at 100 degrees Celsius for hours. Standard boiling does not kill them. They remain dormant, and the moment the water cools down, they germinate and multiply rapidly. Pouchet's experiments were empirically accurate. He had just unluckily chosen an organic medium that contained highly evolved, thermal-resistant spores. If Pouchet had stood his ground and demanded the Academy observe experiments using his hay infusions instead of Pasteur's easily sterilized yeast infusions, he would have proven spontaneous generation right there. Pasteur's boiling methods simply could not defeat heat-resistant spores, and he didn't even know endospores existed yet. That discovery wouldn't happen for another decade. Pasteur won an easy victory, not because his science was bulletproof, but because Pouchet got intimidated by the heavy-handed politics of the Academy and ultimately withdrew. The deck was massively stacked against Pouchet from the start. France in the 1860s was a deeply polarized, tense society, still recovering from the traumas of multiple revolutions. The theory of spontaneous generation was highly politically charged, heavily associated with radical politics, atheism, materialism, and the emerging controversial ideas of Darwinian evolution. The concept that life could generate itself from dead, chemical matter deeply threatened the traditional Catholic view of divine creation and the established social order. Pasteur was a staunch, unwavering conservative, a devout Catholic, fiercely loyal to the traditional establishment and Emperor Napoleon III. He saw himself as a cultural warrior, actively using his scientific refutation of spontaneous generation as a cudgel to defend traditional religious values against what he explicitly termed atheistic materialism. He gave highly publicized, dramatic lectures at the Sorbonne, declaring his swan neck flasks proved the necessity of God the Creator. The French Academy of Sciences, judging the contest, was largely composed of conservative establishment figures, terrified of radical materialism, heavily biased in Pasteur's favor, before a single flask was even boiled. It was the equivalent of a rigged boxing match. Pouchet demanded a broader range of environments. The commission flatly refused, and Pouchet walked away in protest, allowing Pasteur to ride that political wave to absolute scientific supremacy. He was right in the long run about germ theory, obviously, but in that specific battle, he survived solely on political maneuvering and luck. If the Pouchet story highlights his political savvy, what happens a few years later in 1881 crosses the line into straight-up scientific espionage during the anthrax crisis and the massive illusion he orchestrated at Pouilly-le-Fort. Pasteur began applying his germ theory to creating vaccines, having recently stumbled upon a major breakthrough with chicken cholera. He left cultures of the cholera bacteria exposed to the air for an extended period and found that the oxygen seemed to weaken or attenuate the bacteria. When injected into chickens, they didn't die and were immune to the deadly strain later on. He believed he had discovered a universal law of vaccination. Exposing pathogens to oxygen weakens them. He immediately tried to apply this oxygen attenuation method to anthrax. Anthrax was an absolute economic catastrophe in 19th century Europe, a terrifying bacterial disease wiping out millions of francs worth of sheep, cows, and horses. Bacillus anthracis forms incredibly resilient spores that can survive in the soil of pastures for decades. An animal grazes on a cursed field, ingests the spores. The bacteria multiplies explosively in their bloodstream, and the animal drops dead in a matter of hours, bleeding from its orifices. Finding a cure was an urgent national economic imperative for France. A veterinarian named Hippolyte Rossignol, highly skeptical of Pasteur's laboratory-based germ theory, challenged him. Rossignol represented the traditional clinical veterinarians who believed diseases were caused by environmental factors. He organized a highly public, dramatically staged field trial of Pasteur's experimental anthrax vaccine at a farm in Pouilly-le-Fort. Pasteur, possessing an ego that simply could not refuse a theatrical challenge, accepted immediately. In May 1881, they secured a flock of 50 sheep, along with a few cows and goats. The strict protocol dictated that 25 sheep would receive Pasteur's experimental vaccine in 2 doses, while 25 would serve as the control group. Then, all 50 would be injected with a massive, highly virulent, guaranteed lethal strain of anthrax. The stakes were astronomical. If the vaccinated sheep died, his entire career, his hard-fought germ theory, and his credibility would be utterly annihilated. Yet, Pasteur confidently declared to the press that all 25 unvaccinated sheep would perish, and all 25 vaccinated would resist infection. But behind closed doors in his laboratory in Paris, he was terrified. His private notebooks, hidden for a century, revealed that his signature oxygen-attenuated anthrax vaccine was failing miserably in his private animal trials. Because anthrax forms tough spores, it didn't weaken predictably when exposed to oxygen. His vaccine was highly erratic, sometimes protecting guinea pigs, sometimes killing them outright. He was locked into a highly public trial, with a vaccine he knew didn't work consistently. When the final reveal arrived on June 2, 1881, a massive crowd of cynical reporters, anxious farmers, skeptical doctors, and politicians descended on the muddy farm, expecting humiliation. Instead, they were greeted by an absolute, unquestionable medical miracle. Every single one of the 25 vaccinated sheep was grazing peacefully, perfectly healthy, while directly across the fence, the 25 unvaccinated sheep were either already dead, their carcasses bloating in the sun, or in the final agonizing throes of the disease. The precision was mind-boggling. The crowd erupted. The reporter for the London Times sprinted to a telegraph office and sent dispatches that literally changed the global perception of medicine overnight. The French agricultural economy was saved, and the government awarded Pasteur the Grand Croix of the Legion of Honor. When you pull back the curtain on this triumph, the deception hidden beneath it is staggering. The private notebooks reveal that the vaccine Pasteur actually used in those syringes was absolutely not his much-touted oxygen-attenuated vaccine. Realizing his oxygen method was a failure, he secretly swapped the vials, using a chemically inactivated vaccine treated with a caustic chemical called potassium dichromate. Pasteur didn't invent this concept. He quietly lifted it from a rival. A year prior, a brilliant young veterinary professor named Jean-Joseph Henri Toussaint had presented a groundbreaking paper to the Academy of Sciences. Toussaint had hypothesized that you could use chemicals, specifically carbolic acid or heat, to kill or deeply inactivate the anthrax bacilli. The immune system could still recognize the shape of the bacteria and build antibodies safely without injecting live spores. Pasteur had publicly mocked Toussaint, tearing his theory apart at the Academy, passionately arguing that a dead or chemically inactivated vaccine was a biological impossibility. He used his massive influence to discredit Toussaint, but while publicly destroying him, Pasteur's 2 brilliant assistants, Émile Roux and Charles Chamberlain, quietly ran experiments and realized Toussaint was completely right. Chamberlain refined the concept of chemical inactivation, substituting potassium dichromate for carbolic acid to fix the proteins and strip lethality. Seeing his own method failing, Pasteur took Chamberlain's dichromate vaccine, entirely based on Toussaint's discredited theory, and used it to inoculate the sheep. This is intellectual theft on a massive historic scale. When Pasteur wrote his official published report for the Academy of Sciences, he deliberately authored a highly misleading document. He vaguely referred to using a live vaccine, heavily implying he had successfully used his own oxygen attenuation method. He never once mentioned potassium dichromate, and he certainly never gave a shred of credit to Henri Toussaint. Pasteur absorbed all the glory, the massive influx of funding, and the historical legacy. Poor Henri Toussaint watched the man who mocked his theory use it to become a global hero. Toussaint suffered a severe nervous breakdown shortly after. His health collapsed, and he died just a few years later, at the age of 43, completely overshadowed, broken, and forgotten by history, while Pasteur had statues erected in his honor across France. It forces us to confront the ruthless zero-sum ego of 19th century science. Pasteur was fiercely patriotic. He genuinely believed that his personal success and leadership were absolutely necessary to push French science forward and defeat German rivals like Robert Koch. In his mind, the institution of Pasteur was synonymous with the progress of humanity. Does the end justify the means? By stealing that formula and staging that dramatic trial, he single-handedly forced the global medical community to accept the concept of vaccination. He saved millions of animals and secured the funding to build an empire of disease research that would go on to conquer diphtheria, tetanus, and plague. But he actively crushed an innocent, brilliant rival, and he lied to the entire scientific community to maintain his monopoly on truth. That exact ethical flexibility, that willingness to operate in the shadows for the greater good, brings us to the most famous, the most celebrated, and by far the most terrifying chapter of his entire life. To understand the gravity of what Pasteur did, we must deeply understand the primal terror that rabies held over the population in the 1880s. Rabies was not the most common disease. Tuberculosis and cholera killed far more people. But rabies caused a unique, visceral panic, and the terror lies in its biology. When a person is bitten by a rabid wolf or dog, the virus doesn't spread through the bloodstream like a normal bacterial infection. It enters the peripheral nerves at the site of the bite and begins a slow, silent, microscopic crawl up the nervous system, millimeter by millimeter, traveling via retrograde axonal transport toward the brain. This creates an agonizing incubation period. It could take weeks or even months for the virus to reach the central nervous system. The victim just had to wait in unbearable psychological suspense, wondering if they were infected. Once the virus hits the brainstem, the symptoms begin and the fatality rate is 100%. Nobody survives. The virus essentially hijacks the brain, causing extreme aggression, terrifying hallucinations, muscle spasms, and hydrophobia. A violent, choking spasm of the throat at the mere sight or sound of water. The victim dies in a state of sheer madness and agonizing thirst. The standard medical treatment at the time was literally having a doctor hold the victim down and burn the bite wound deep into the flesh with a red-hot iron, hoping to cauterize the tissue and destroy the poison before it entered the nerves. It was medieval brutality. Pasteur set his sights on conquering rabies, but scientifically, this was a massive leap into the dark. Unlike anthrax or cholera, which were large bacteria he could easily see under his microscope and cultivate in broths, rabies is a viral disease. The rabies virus is incredibly tiny, entirely invisible to the optical microscopes of the 19th century. he was fighting a ghost. He didn't even have the concept of a virus as we define it today. He just knew there was a self-replicating infectious agent hiding within the saliva and the nervous system of the victims. His genius shines through his methodology here, figuring out that he couldn't grow the invisible agent in a glass flask. He used living animals as his test tubes. He began passing the virus from the brain of one infected rabbit directly into the brain of another, over and over, dozens of times. He created what he called a virus fix, a strain of rabies that had a perfectly predictable, hyperlethal incubation period of exactly 7 days in rabbits. Having stabilized the enemy, he had to figure out how to weaken it to make a vaccine. He extracted the spinal cords of the rabbits that had just died from his hyperlethal rabies and suspended these highly infectious cords inside sterile glass jars. At the bottom of the jar, he placed a chemical called potassium hydroxide, or potash. The potash acted as a desiccant, aggressively sucking all the moisture out of the air inside the jar. As the spinal cord slowly dried out over a period of up to 14 days, the rabies virus inside it gradually degraded and lost its virulence. The drying process physically degraded the delicate lipid envelope and the RNA of the virus. He developed a theoretical treatment protocol, a race against time known as post-exposure prophylaxis. A person gets bitten by a rabid dog. The street virus starts to slow crawl up their leg nerves toward the brain, and the patient comes to Pasteur. On day 1, Pasteur takes a rabbit spinal cord that has been drying in a jar for 14 days. Essentially dead, harmless tissue with barely any viral trace, mashes it up in a sterile saline liquid, and injects it into the patient's stomach. The patient's immune system detects this degraded viral debris and begins to mount a defense. The next day, Pasteur injects a spinal cord that has only been drying for 13 days. It is slightly fresher, slightly more dangerous. The next day, a 12-day cord. He repeats this escalating process every single day for 10 to 14 days, constantly pushing the patient's immune system to build antibodies faster and faster. Finally, on the last day of treatment, he injects the patient with a fully virulent, fresh, deadly spinal cord that has only been drying for 1 or 2 days, a dose that would absolutely kill any unprotected animal. The theory is, if the protocol works, the patient's immune system has been artificially accelerated to such a high state of readiness that it easily destroys the final lethal injection and hunts down the original street virus before it can reach the brain. This brings us to the most famous medical encounter in history. Enter Joseph Meister. It is July 1885. A 9-year-old boy from the Alsace region is brought to Pasteur's laboratory in Paris by his frantic, terrified mother. Little Joseph has been severely mauled on his way to school. A rabid dog knocked him to the ground and bit him 14 times on his hands, legs, and thighs. The wounds are deep, saturated with rabid saliva, and the boy can barely walk. Based on the severity and location of the bites, the doctors agree. Joseph Meister is facing absolutely certain horrifying death. Pasteur is faced with a terrifying decision, writing in his diary about experiencing acute and harrowing anxiety. We must remember a crucial legal fact here. Louis Pasteur is a chemist. He is not a licensed medical doctor. He is not legally permitted to touch a human patient. If he oversees the injection of this experimental viral soup into a child, and the child dies, he could face criminal prosecution for practicing medicine without a license, or even manslaughter. To protect himself, he calls in 2 prominent licensed physicians, Dr. Vulpian and Dr. Grancher. They examine the boy, conclude that Meister's case is hopeless, and tell Pasteur that since the boy is already condemned to death, he has the moral justification to attempt the experimental treatment. Over the next 10 agonizing days, Dr. Grancher physically administers the escalating series of spinal cord injections into the boy's abdomen, while Pasteur dictates the dosage. On the final day, they inject Joseph Meister with the fully lethal fresh rabies virus. And Joseph Meister lives. He never develops a single symptom of rabies, recovers completely, and eventually grows up to become a caretaker at the Institut Pasteur. When the news breaks, Pasteur is elevated from a great scientist to a global god of medicine. Donations pour in from across the globe, from emperors, from peasants, and from the Tsar of Russia, funding the construction of the magnificent Institut Pasteur in Paris. It is the ultimate pristine hero story, until the private notebooks strike again. When historians finally gained access to Pasteur's daily private lab journals and cross-referenced the dates, they realized the public story of Joseph Meister was a very carefully constructed facade. The reality of the Meister treatment was a terrifying, reckless gamble. Pasteur had publicly stated to the Academy that he had thoroughly and consistently tested this post-exposure treatment on dogs before trying it on a human. In truth, his private notebooks reveal that his success rate in treating dogs after they were infected was only 62%. Nearly 4 out of 10 dogs given the treatment still died of rabies. Furthermore, the specific protocol he used on Joseph Meister, the exact sequence of dried rabbit cords stepping down from 14 days to 1 day over that specific 10-day period, had never been completely tested on animals. He was literally improvising the exact dosage schedule on a human child in real time. And the most shocking revelation of all, the secret he took to his grave. Joseph Meister was not the first human subject. The archives show that just 2 months before Meister, in May 1885, Pasteur secretly authorized the treatment of a 61-year-old man named Mr. Girard. Girard had been bitten, and Pasteur's team gave him 2 injections of the rabies vaccine before the hospital administration found out and stopped the unauthorized human experimentation. The man survived, but it was highly unclear if the dog that bit him actually had rabies. Then, the true tragedy. In June 1885, just weeks before Joseph Meister arrived, an 11-year-old girl named Julie Antoinette Pouon was brought to Pasteur. She had been bitten 37 days prior. She was given the experimental vaccine and died the very next day. Clinically speaking, it was highly likely that the disease was already too far advanced in her nervous system for the vaccine to work. But the ethical reality remains. Pasteur had already crossed the line into human experimentation, had a catastrophic failure with a dead child, and completely buried those records to protect his reputation before he rolled the dice again with Joseph Meister. By modern medical ethics, Pasteur would be stripped of his funding and publicly disgraced for injecting a live lethal virus into a child without definitive, consistent proof. But the historical counter-argument is the result. It worked. Because the disease was universally fatal, with no alternative therapy, there was nothing to lose but the timeline of the death. Fortune favors the prepared mind, but it is genuinely terrifying to realize how much of modern medical foundation balances on the edge of a coin flip in those early unregulated days. Of course, not every coin flip came up heads. The mass rollout of the rabies vaccine had serious casualties. Over in Odessa, in the Russian Empire, an allied bacteriological station tried to replicate Pasteur's methods and ended up causing a disaster, killing 80% of a massive flock of sheep with a faulty anthrax vaccine. And with the rabies vaccine in Paris, there were high-profile human deaths. Lord Doneraile, a wealthy Irish aristocrat, was bitten by a tame, rabid fox, received the full course of the Pasteur treatment, and died of furious rabies a few months later. Pasteur and his team could easily explain away cases like Lord Doneraile by arguing the patient arrived too late. But the Jules Rouillet affair in October 1886 involves active, deliberate perjury. A 10-year-old boy named Jules Rouillet was bitten on the arm by a stray dog. Crucially, the bite went through his thick winter overcoat, meaning it was likely a low-exposure bite. He received the full 12-day intensive Pasteur treatment, but a month later, the boy died. His symptoms leading up to death were highly unusual. They didn't look like typical furious street rabies. The boy's father filed a formal legal complaint, accusing the clinic of killing his son with the vaccine. Pasteur himself was away in Italy, recovering from a series of strokes, so the crisis management fell to his closest lieutenants, Dr. Émile Roux and Dr. Brouardel. During the formal legal autopsy, they extracted a sample of the dead boy's medulla oblongata, the lower part of the brainstem, and injected it directly under the dura mater into the brains of 2 healthy rabbits. Within days, both rabbits developed severe paralytic rabies and died. The scientific truth was undeniable. Jules Rouillet died of rabies. Given the unusual symptoms, there was a terrifying possibility that the boy didn't die from the street virus on the dog's teeth, but from the laboratory strain of rabies present in the vaccine itself, which Roux knew caused paralytic symptoms. Armed with this devastating empirical data, Roux and Brouardel walked into a court of law, raised their right hands, and formally perjured themselves. They testified that the rabbit inoculation tests were entirely negative, and declared officially that the boy died of a uremic attack, simple kidney failure, completely unrelated to the dog or the vaccine. They made the conscious decision to sacrifice the truth of one boy's death to protect the survival of the program, a utilitarian noble lie, believing the vaccine would save tens of thousands of lives in the long run. This speaks volumes to the authoritarian culture Pasteur created. He demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty from his followers, whom he called Pasteurians, imbuing them with the belief that his scientific vision transcended normal ethical boundaries. He was also a man of his time in the worst possible ways. While serving as the dean of the Faculty of Sciences in Lille, he issued a directive explicitly banning women from attending his science classes, formally writing that the presence of ladies in the lecture hall was a nuisance and would inevitably cause an appreciable lowering of the level of teaching. It is a blatant misogyny that is comically ironic, considering his wife, Marie Laurent, managed his entire administrative life, organized his notes, and was his primary intellectual sounding board. He literally couldn't have built his empire without the intellectual labor of a woman. Yet his monumental ego demanded that he stand entirely alone in the spotlight as the solitary, divinely inspired genius. Despite the intellectual theft, the perjury, the gambling with children's lives, and the misogyny, his final ledger is undeniably monumental. He single-handedly hammered immunology into global public health policy. He intentionally expanded the general term vaccination to apply universally to any artificially weakened disease agent, honoring Edward Jenner's specific use of cowpox, vacca. He meticulously identified the microscopic parasites decimating silkworms, saving the French silk industry. He saved the massive wine and beer industries of Europe by discovering that heating liquids to specific temperatures killed spoilage bacteria without ruining the taste. Pasteurization, a process that has prevented countless millions of cases of foodborne illness over the last century. When he suffered his final series of debilitating strokes and died in 1895 at the age of 72, he was revered on a scale usually reserved for conquering generals. The French government immediately declared a state funeral, wanting to bury him in the Pantheon in Paris, the ultimate secular resting place for France's greatest heroes alongside Voltaire, Rousseau, and Victor Hugo. But Marie-Laurent, fiercely loyal to his specific vision to the very bitter end, refused the government. She insisted he be buried where his work lived, at his beloved Institut Pasteur. His tomb is an architectural marvel, a private crypt located deep beneath the main building, designed in a breathtaking, opulent, Neo-Byzantine style that looks exactly like the tomb of an ancient Roman emperor in Ravenna. Instead of religious icons, the massive gold mosaics that cover the walls and vaulted ceiling depict his scientific conquests. Intricate vines and hops representing wine and beer, mulberry trees, and moths for the silkworms, cattle and sheep honoring his triumph over anthrax, and terrifying depictions of rabid dogs and rabbits representing his final medical victory over rabies. The teenage boy from the Jura Mountains, who loved to draw with pastels, ended up using that exact same intense artistic eye to observe the microscopic world. He couldn't paint the world on a canvas, so he fundamentally reshaped human history instead, bending the invisible world to his will and bending the rules of ethics to his ambition. We are left with a profoundly dualistic, deeply complex portrait. He is undeniably a heroic savior who revolutionized antiseptic surgery and created the foundational principles of modern immunology. Yet, he was a manipulative showman who crushed brilliant rivals, authorized cover-ups of vaccine deaths, and injected an untested lethal virus into a 9-year-old boy based on a theoretical hunch. I want you to imagine for a moment that it is the present year. A brilliant, highly publicized scientist announces they have finally cured a terminal, untreatable form of cancer. Millions rejoice. But a few years later, investigative journalists uncover their private, encrypted emails. We discover the scientists completely forged their ethical board approvals, lied about their animal trials to rush directly to human testing, and actively stole the core chemical formula from a quiet, unfunded rival. Would we build them a golden tomb covered in mosaics? Would we name massive research institutes after them? Or would we strip them of their medical licenses, destroy their legacy, and put them in a federal jail cell? Does the ultimate, massive benefit to the survival of humanity completely erase the sins, the intellectual thefts, and the dangerous, unethical gambles of the individual? If today's exploration made you question everything you thought you knew about the flawless heroes of history, make sure to subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Hit the like button, share this audio with a friend who loves a good historical scandal, and drop a comment below. Tell us, was Louis Pasteur a hero, a villain, or something much more complicated in between? We genuinely want to hear your take on this moral dilemma. Thank you so much for exploring the murky, endlessly fascinating waters of medical history with us today. Until next time, keep questioning the history books and keep looking closely at the world around you. You never know what invisible, microscopic truths you might find hiding in the dust.